With the release of Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 3, the Tomorrowverse has officially come to an end. But not just that, the movie did also focus on how the Tomorrowverse is a direct continuation of the DCAMU. Initially, I was going to make a video ranking just the Tomorrowverse, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how fitting it would be to also include the 16 movies of the DCAMU. So in this video, I'll be ranking all 26 movies released throughout the entire 11-year run of the DCAMU/Tomorrowverse. Both universes also had shorts, but I won't be including them because they're simply incomparable to full movies. Make sure to leave a like, leave your favorite and least favorite movie in the comments, and subscribe to help me get to 100,000 subscribers. And let's begin. Justice League Warworld is a really weird movie. Despite the title, it's not really a Justice League movie, but a Trinity movie, but barely even that. Half of the movie takes place within these fake worlds as the Trinity don't recall their true identities. Unfortunately, these worlds are not interesting or entertaining enough to make up for the fact that, with the exception of like one scene, none of this ends up mattering at all for either the story of this movie or of the Tomorrowverse, nor does any of it contribute to the character development of the characters, nor do they really get any interesting character dynamics. Then, when they finally exit these false realities and get to Warworld, the movie still doesn't do anything interesting. The Trinity still don't have any interesting dynamics or interactions. Warworld is barely explored. Mongol is just a confusing exposition dump with a really bad design, and a lot of what happens makes no sense. Then, it turned out that not even the ending of this movie really happened, but that's actually a positive, since Martian Manhunter's apparent death really sucked. Crisis Part 3 ended up making this movie matter, but this movie really does not stand on its own at all, and it barely even counts as a movie. Green Lantern Beware My Power is the Tomorrowverse movie that is most plagued by the weirdly persistent sound design issue of there being weird pauses in between dialogue, which makes for an awkward viewing experience at times and gives the movie a generally cheap feeling. Aside from that, the movie doesn't quite do justice to the Green Lantern Corps. The lore is simplified and the Corps weakened as they're killed by Parallax, only for the new recruit with barely any experience to single-handedly take out that same threat that took all of them out, which just doesn't make any sense. This also extends to Hal Jordan, who it feels like the writers wanted to push down in order to prop John Stewart up, which is not really a good way to go about something like that. It's not all bad, there's some good animation and fight scenes. I liked Green Arrow's role, it's pretty entertaining, and Adam Strange is compelling, but just in general, Green Lantern Beware My Power is a very disappointing return to the Green Lantern franchise after a decade with zero Green Lantern content. Wonder Woman Bloodlines is unique on this list in its art style. The art style itself is fine, but it is weird and confusing why the art style isn't the same as the DCAMU. Aside from that, Bloodlines is simply very forgettable, with its biggest impact being Diana changing her armor. The story isn't great, the villain is underwhelming, and I just don't really recall ever being impressed by this movie, which is a shame, since it is the only Wonder Woman movie on this list. Reign of the Superman is pretty disappointing. You won't see its predecessor for a while on this list because, unlike the first part, the movie lacks the same intensity, heart, soul, emotion, and character focus, opting instead to focus mostly on action, and an unnecessary amount of screen time is dedicated to the other Justice Leaguers. The story this movie is adapting is inherently not as good as the death of Superman, but for all intents and purposes, there's no reason why they couldn't reinvent the story into something better, something that focuses on Clark and Lois's reunion, following up on how effective the previous movie was at developing their relationship. There are some really fun moments and some great action, and it's not entirely 100% completely devoid of substance, but it's not a great follow-up to the death of Superman, which again will be way higher on the list. Justice League vs. the Teen Titans title kind of pisses me off because it suggests that this is an equal Justice League and Teen Titans movie. Justice League also comes first in the title, that would focus on them fighting each other. In actuality, it's a full-on Teen Titans movie where they fight the Justice League for just like a few minutes. The movie does have really good animation, action, voice acting, and music, but I don't love the story, and I don't think the movie does a good enough job at showing off the character dynamics between the Titans, something its sequel does a lot better. Batman Hush is unique for the DCAMU Batman movies because it's the only one that isn't at all a Bat Family movie, unless you count Catwoman. That in and of itself wouldn't mean anything for the quality, but that does speak a bit towards what Batman Hush is. A much more bare bones and much more simple Batman story, which is true for the comic as well, except the comic at least introduces a great new villain. The movie makes a change in order to have its own twist, as it's revealed that Hush is the Riddler, which I think in general minimizes the impact or quality of villain of both Hush and the Riddler, for what amounts to an underwhelming twist. The animation, action, and voice acting is good, and I like the focus on Batman and Catwoman's relationship, but this has got to be my least favorite Batman movie out of the 6 in the DCAMU/Tomorrowverse. Justice League Throne of Atlantis is a fun movie with a good villain, great action and animation, and is a decent introduction to the character of Aquaman, but I really wouldn't say it's too effective as a Justice League movie, as the team doesn't really have any fun or interesting moments in their interactions, nor does the movie really have much in the way of strong substance, like maybe potentially the Atlantis royal family drama or Aquaman's pulling between two worlds, something that the live-action movie based on the same story did a lot better. Legion of Superheroes ended up being a pretty important movie for the Tomorrowverse as it introduces Supergirl, who ended up being very important for the Crisis, but if I'm being honest, it's the Crisis trilogy that did a lot better of a job at exploring her character, specifically Part 2, and the Legion of Superheroes has a very derivative story. It feels like Kara goes through a very similar story to the Legion episode of Justice League Unlimited, and although it's a bit repetitive, it does actually largely work. Kara not feeling at home in the present day Earth as she grew up in Krypton, so she goes to the future, does actually make for a pretty compelling story. Kara and Brainy's romance was a bit undercooked, but ultimately is pretty cute. The animation and voice acting is good, the sound design issue is very minimal, but it is honestly still there at times, and Brainiac is a decent villain. But what I did really like was actually the Mon-El twist, just because I did not see it coming, and in general when it comes to the more minor characters, I don't mind and even appreciate changes like these. Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2 is definitely the weakest of the trilogy, as it acts as the bridge between the two, mostly giving background and lore explanation for the likes of the Monitor, Supergirl, and Psychopirate. These characters do have compelling backstories and arcs that connect really well to the story, but due to the overwhelming amount of flashbacks and lack of story progression, the movie could feel a bit boring. Then again, when the story does progress, those are actually the weakest parts, as the fight scenes against the Shadow Demons feel very cheap and poorly animated. The Bat Family's focus could have been better, and while it was cool for them to push the Constantine of it all forward, Jon Stewart's part to play in all of that was pretty awful, losing his ring for what felt like no reason. That all being said, the movie went out on a high note as the three main characters converge, with Psychopirate manipulating Supergirl into killing the Monitor, all being a great adaptation of the moment from the comics, making the whole movie feel like it all came together really well. So while it's not great, I will say it is pretty good. Son of Batman is a good introduction to Damian Wayne and does a good job at telling his origin story of becoming Robin, helped by some really great animation, action, voice acting, and a good villain. Damian could be annoying, which is part of his character, but they might have gone a bit too hard on that here. It's something that later movies actually balance a bit better, and the movie does lack a bit of emotional substance that I feel like would have been really easy to find in this father and son dynamic, but these are mostly nitpicks, relatively large ones, as the movie is not great, but it is still certainly good. Justice League War is a very simple story. Earth is invaded by aliens, 7 heroes come together to fight them, and along the way form the Justice League. It's a simple story, but a well-executed one, as most members are both introduced and well fleshed out here, all given some good moments of action and a lot of fun and interesting interactions between each other, that alongside some great animation, action, voice acting, and music, do kind of make this very simple story a bit more interesting. It's honestly just that simplicity that really holds this movie back. Batman Bad Blood is like the polar opposite of Hush, as it's entirely a Bat Family movie, barely even featuring Batman, or at least barely featuring Bruce Wayne. It's really cool to see Dick become Batman, teaming up with Damian's Robin. This movie gives us what I think is the best version of Batwoman in outside media, and unlike the previous placement on this list, the story is anything but simple, and has a really good villain and a lot of twists surrounding her and Batman. I don't think anything in this movie is fantastic, but I don't really have many complaints about it either, so everything here is just about good. Justice League Dark did not need Batman, and it all boils down to a simple fight between a bunch of magical characters, but the movie has an interesting story of the hero solving a magical mystery, alongside great animation, action, and voice acting, but more than anything, it has some really fun and interesting character dynamics that makes for a very entertaining watch. Constantine City of Demons doesn't have the fun character dynamics of Justice League Dark, but it does have a far more interesting and compelling story that ends up being a lot more unique for the DCAMU. Constantine and his darker corner of the magical side of the DC universe are both extremely well fleshed out here, which becomes very important later on, due to Constantine's huge role in both the DCAMU and later the Tomorrowverse. Batman vs. Robin does a bit of a better job compared to its predecessor at balancing Damian's personality and delves a bit more, and effectively so, into the unique and interesting dynamic between Bruce and Damian, which is interwoven relatively well into the Court of Owls storyline to make for a rather compelling conflict between the two, leading to a satisfying resolution. The Court themselves and even Talon are rather underwhelming as villains, and there's nothing here to push this movie to being something I'd consider great, but I'd say it's actually relatively close. Superman Man of Tomorrow, the namesake of its universe, started the Tomorrowverse off on a pretty good note, as it takes a relatively unique and interesting take on Superman's first year, where he is completely unaware of Krypton, leading to a very grounded and very human-feeling Clark Kent, which is definitely my preferred characterization for Superman, which then contrasts really well with the movie's primary focus on the concept of aliens. Parasite, the main villain, is an alien-looking human who people are afraid of, while Superman is a human-looking alien that people embrace. Throw in a few more aliens like Martian Manhunter and Lobo, and all in all, that makes for an interesting story and focus, and a pretty great main villain. Aside from that, there's some good animation voice acting, but nothing amazing, and let's just say the sound design issue had not quite started yet. Suicide Squad Hell to Pay quickly became what I consider to be the quintessential Suicide Squad project in outside media, and was only dethroned by the Suicide Squad 3 years later. The movie is a dark and brutal adventure with some fantastic character dynamics and some really awesome twists, including one that connects directly to Flashpoint, something I never would have expected out of a Suicide Squad movie, but it works really, really well. What holds this movie back is that it does feel a bit cheaper and lower budget than the rest of the DCAMU, and has moments where I recall being a bit bored, but this has to be one of the more ambitious stories in the series, and for the most part, it really, really works, and has a really good villain as well. Justice Society World War II is where the sound design issue of the Tomorrowverse started, and that's easily the movie's biggest issue, as those weird and awkward pauses are quite prevalent, making the movie feel very low budget. The reason this movie is this high on the list, regardless, is that everything else about this movie is really great. After the soft launch that was Man of Tomorrow, Justice Society greatly expanded the Tomorrowverse by introducing the Flash, the Multiverse, Earth 2, the JSA, and even setting up both the Justice League and Crisis on Infinite Earths. They managed to do all that in just one movie, and did so really well. There are some really great moments of action and animation, a pretty great villain, multiple effective and unexpected twists, and some very interesting and dark takes on a lot of Earth 2, as well as even some emotional moments. Barry's design does kinda suck, Hawkman's voice doesn't really quite fit, and the voice acting is never incredible, but this movie is integral to the structure of the Tomorrowverse and was responsible, alongside the short Constantine House of Mystery, in completely engrossing me in the overarching story of the Tomorrowverse. Teen Titans The Judas Contract is a huge upgrade over its predecessor that does a way better job at capturing the dynamics of the Teen Titans, as it allows them to hold their own story without the Justice League present, all while adapting what is the most famous Teen Titans story, and adapting it really well. While expected, Terra's betrayal and then her ensuing death does hit a bit, especially from Beast Boy's perspective. Slade is given a big upgrade over his previous appearance in the DCAMU, if nothing else because he shines more as a Teen Titans villain, which is what he is at his core, not a Batman villain, and all the technical aspects of the movie are great, like animation, action, voice acting, and music. The only thing holding the movie back for me is that it feels rather familiar, having been adapted already, and for the most part, very similarly, but also maybe a bit better in the Teen Titans cartoon. Still, I will say this is one of the stronger entries in the DCAMU. Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 3 was a surprisingly decent ending to both the Tomorrowverse and the DCAMU, as the storyline finally comes together in a relatively seamless way that feels very rewarding as someone who has watched since the beginning of the DCAMU. Furthermore, this is the only Justice League movie out of the 4 in the Tomorrowverse to actually feel like a Justice League movie that splits its focus between many different heroes, giving important roles to almost all of the characters with roles prior to this, all while adapting the Crisis with its own DCAMU/Tomorrowverse twist, including the merging of Harbinger and Supergirl coming together to make for an upgraded death over the comics, Batman feeling important to the Crisis unlike the comics, Warworld's ending is partially redeemed and connected to the Crisis relatively seamlessly through Psychopirate, Kevin Conroy is given a great final line as Batman, and Wonder Woman has a particularly compelling ending that connects to an ending adapting the merging of worlds that works, I think, really well. Unfortunately, the budget does shine through, some of the action is slow and boring, and some of the animation is limited. The sound design issue occurs a few times, and the villain sucks both in design and also the fact that he has like no dialogue. So yeah, this is a movie that is quite ambitious given its budget, and for all intents and purposes it would be a whole lot better if it had that budget, but for what it is, I can't say I was disappointed, and I particularly loved the ending. Batman The Long Halloween Part 1 and its immediate sequel feel like they have higher budgets than the rest of the Tomorrowverse, probably because Batman is just a bigger franchise than even the Justice League, and so there's none of the sound design issue, and the These two movies have probably the best animation in the Tomorrowverse, with also really good visuals and voice acting, and the story from the comic is adapted really well in this dark detective thriller with a mystery that becomes captivating and compelling, leading to an intense climax right in the end of part 1 that brings it all together. I didn't love Joker's place in the movie, it felt like he really didn't need to be there, but on the other hand, I did really like Batman and Catwoman's dynamic. Batman A Long Halloween Part 2 is ever so slightly better than Part 1 as the story starts to move faster, becomes more intriguing and compelling, while the animation, visuals, and voice acting are all ever so mildly improved as well. What I especially loved here is the way this movie created Two-Face because of how inherently compelling his origin is from the original comic, and how well they adapted it, all leading into a great twist ending that is similarly very well adapted. These two movies are almost entirely equal in quality and together make for a pretty great 3-hour epic, but it just so happens that the second half is slightly better than the first. Either way, both of these movies are the best Batman movies in the DCAMU/Tomorrowverse. I am a sucker for a good Flash story, and despite the title, Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1 is exactly that, telling a non-linear story from Barry's perspective that fills in the gaps of the Tomorrowverse relatively well, showing Barry and Iris meeting, the origin of the Justice League, the destruction of Earth 3, and the beginning of the Crisis, all of which is great in its own right, but at the center of it all is this love story between Barry and Iris, revealed in a twist that the entire time they've been living in Flash time as they try to save the world, putting a really interesting twist on Barry's death from the comics, kind of improving it in the process. Aside from that, this movie has some really good animation, visuals, and voice acting. The movie is a bit of a slow burn at times with very minimal action. The sound design issue does prop up at times, and the budget definitely feels low, but for all intents and purposes, this is as good as it could get given all their resources. And so, Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1 is my favorite movie in the Tomorrowverse. However, this does mean that the Tomorrowverse never quite reached the heights that the DCAMU did. Justice League Dark Apocalypse War is what truly brought the DCAMU together for me, just in time to end it. Up until this point, the DCAMU felt a bit disconnected, and as if it wasn't really truly leading to anything, or at least not really. This movie changed that and changed the legacy of the DCAMU, bringing just about every project in the DCAMU together into a story that doesn't play anything safe, taking the universe in a high-stakes, exciting new direction, in this really well-crafted and well-thought-out culmination that perfectly balances its high stakes with some fantastic character interactions and dynamics. Interesting romances, emotional moments, brutal and shocking deaths, intense moments, and some fantastic action, animation, voice acting, and incredible music to tie it all together. There are moments that feel cheap and certain characters, including ones who are important in prior projects, are unceremoniously killed off. It's obviously not perfect, but it's just as good as a culmination to the DCAMU could have been, and in the end, it ties it all together as it concludes the universe the same way it began, Barry Allen changing the timeline, which is a movie that we have yet to get to. The Death of Superman might have been the movie that single-handedly made me fall in love with the character of Superman. Until this point, the DCAMU Superman had been entirely based on his New 52 characterization, so a bit more alien, a bit more removed from humanity, less hopeful and smiley, and even dating Wonder Woman, all while the DCEU Superman was all doing the same thing, or at least for the most part. Then you have The Death of Superman, which makes a really strong case for a more classic Superman. His characterization here is simply superior in every way. He's simultaneously a relatable person and the quintessential superhero the rest look up to. His relationship with Lois is given primary focus, and it's really compelling here, because specifically of how Lois is interested in Clark rather than Superman, making both Clark and Lois feel so much more real and so much more relatable. All in all, that's a mythos change that I'm glad is now sticking. I never liked it how Lois only cared about Superman. This is a way better way to go about it. Then, Superman's essence is perfectly captured with moments that could bring a grown man to tears as he fights to his dying breath to save as many people as he can. The focus this movie puts on Clark Kent, his relationship with Lois, his role as Superman, and how he inspires hope leads to a death that is genuinely emotional and genuinely sad, even all while knowing he will obviously return. The animation is some of the best, if not the best, in the DCAMU. The action might just also be the best, and the music and voice acting are top tier. This is obviously a story that has been told a lot. You have the comics, you have Superman Doomsday, the DCEU, and then more recently Superman and Lois. However, this is in my opinion the greatest possible telling of the Death of Superman story, and the best movie in the DCAMU/Tomorrowverse. There was one movie before the DCAMU, however, that is just a bit better. Justice League: The Flashpoint Paradox might just be the best movie DC Animation has ever produced, telling a really interesting story that puts the Flash into this dark and twisted take on the DC universe, Tomorrowverse that makes for a really interesting setting. Thomas Wayne Batman, evil Aquaman and Wonder Woman, skinny and locked away Superman, it's all really interesting, but at its core, this is a Flash story, and a really compelling one at that, with a reveal that brings everything together in the quality of the story, the emotional component, and the rivalry between Flash and the Reverse Flash, all of which is so captivating, beyond that of the setting or interesting twist on certain characters. Beyond that, the animation is fantastic, the voice acting is incredible, and I'd say this is the movie on the list with the best music, which goes a long way, as I absolutely loved the main theme, and I'm glad it came back later on in Apocalypse War. This would all mean that if this is the best movie in this series, that the DCAMU/Tomorrowverse peaked really early. And yeah, I guess that's true, but at the same time, throughout the 11 years of DC animation, some very compelling and some very high quality stories were told, in a series of 3 interconnected timelines, which all come together in the end to feel like one long interconnected story, which is rather impressive in my opinion. Obviously, some of these movies are really bad, and the budgets of some of these movies are really low, but if we're talking about the interconnected story between these 11 years, it's kind of the best the DC Universe has ever gotten. It's certainly better than the DCEU, and the average of these two universes from my ratings is exactly 7 out of 10, which I think seems fitting. It's good, there are projects that are better, projects that are worse, 7 just feels right. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and thanks for watching.